So today we are talking about incorporating digital resources into your paper quilt patterns. So what this is basically a QR code that would be on kind of the paper pattern that you sell in a quilt shop or something like that your customer can scan, and that links to a whole set of digital resources that might be helpful to go along with that pattern, but that you didn't want to include in the paper pattern because of length purposes. So what might you want to include in this kind of digital resource set? So things you can link to are coloring sheets. This is really helpful for paper patterns because if you're actually going to use a coloring sheet, you don't usually want to do coloring on a glossy, high gloss, high quality paper bound printed pattern. Not fun to color in. Usually whatever markers or pencils you're using don't like to write very well on that paper. And so if you're going to end up using that coloring sheet, you usually have to end up photocopying it first anyways. And so including kind of a digital download, a PDF download that somebody can just download and print off and color as many versions as they want can be really helpful and really a much better experience for the user anyways. Another thing that you can include are cutting diagrams, and I'm not talking about ones that are essential to the quilt pattern here. So if you've got a fat quarter version with fairly complicated fat quarter cutting, you need to have that diagram in there. There's no way around it. Don't put this in the digital resources. It's essential to the quilt pattern. But what I've seen frequently lately is a lot of people wanting to include cutting diagrams for like yardage. Those aren't essential because yardage is usually cut down by kind of cutting with the fabric strips and then subcutting those into smaller pieces. Most people can follow that just fine without a cutting diagram, but some people find it helpful. And so if you want to provide those, you totally can, but it doesn't need to go in the paper pattern to begin with. Just put it into the digital resources so it's there for people who want it. Alternate colorways are another thing. So alternate colorways, alternate assembly methods, arrangements, whatever you want to call them. Anything that, you know, if you've got a 3-color version, a 5-color version, 12-color ombre, and like all of these different ways that you can make the same design, but that would be really overwhelming to put in a paper pattern, not to mention super lengthy. You can drop those into a digital resource and just kind of advertise that on the cover, like, hey, there's these other resources, but here's the main one that you're going to get in this pattern. You can access them with a QR code. That's totally fine. And then they have access to it if they want it without making the pattern like 20 pages long, which would be super expensive to get printed. Templates are another great one. So if you've got like curved templates or any kind of cutting template that you need to include, again, to be able to actually use those, you have to cut them out. Most people don't want to cut a nice bound paper booklet that can only be cut once, especially if you've got double-sided paper, then you're cutting through instructions. It's just not good. So you end up either having to photocopy those or it's basically a single-use pattern, which isn't great. So putting those in a digital resource is super helpful. Another way you could do it is just by getting those paper templates kind of printed on regular paper and folding them up as an insert to your paper pattern. That's totally fine too. But again, it's another thing that you got to assemble as you're kind of bagging up your patterns to get them ready for sale. So putting those templates in just like a PDF one-pager that can be downloaded from the digital resources and printed off can be really, really helpful for most of your customers. Cutting labels are another one. Again, these are things that have to be cut out. So these are little labels that list, you know, the quantity and the label on the fabric cut so that you can kind of pin them to the stacks of fabric as you're cutting. Really helpful if you've got a lot of fabric cuts. Goes along with labeling, and I will link that video here. But having those kind of in a digital resource, again, single page PDF download that they can just print out and cut up as many times as they need to without destroying their pattern at all, really helpful. Another thing that you can put in there are assembly diagrams. So if you've got like 6 sizes, some of those like king and queen sizes, the assembly diagrams get enormous, and it's really helpful to have them, but really difficult to include in a paper pattern. So you can kind of bump those to the digital resources and just direct people there if they want to see an individual assembly diagram for like a queen size. Now you still need to include an assembly diagram in the actual pattern for some of the smaller sizes, but frequently the larger sizes are just kind of repeats of the smaller sizes. And so those are okay to kind of bump to digital resources so that you don't take up huge amounts of space in your pattern. Okay, pause for a minute because I totally forgot when I was recording this to mention one of the more obvious things that you can include in the digital resources, and that is videos. So if you've ever recorded like a YouTube tutorial or something like that for your pattern, you can totally link that here with a QR code, either by embedding it on this kind of digital resource page that we'll talk about constructing in a minute, or by just linking directly to the YouTube video. These can either be public videos or like an unlisted private YouTube video. It doesn't really matter. So that's another really great option for adding to the digital resources. Back to the video. The benefit of doing this, obviously, is that you shorten your paper pattern significantly. Some of these things can take up 4 or 5 extra pages, and so just bumping them to a digital resources allows you to keep that pattern nice and compact, keeps it from getting too overwhelming for your reader, but still offers these resources available to them if they need them, which is super, super helpful. Now, there's lots of tips and techniques for keeping patterns kind of condensed and shortened, and I will link to that video here because this is just one of many, but it is a super effective technique for keeping your pattern nice and concise. So the way I actually functionally include this in a pattern is by kind of putting a frame around my little QR code. I like to put, some sort of title saying, hey, digital resources, or scan me, something that invites them to kind of see what it's all about. But I also like to add a little section in the before you begin section in my pattern on the first page that kind of explains what it is and what kind of resources you can find in there. So people aren't just like blindly scanning this thing and wondering what's going to come up, right? That's not really a great experience. So let's talk about how you actually implement this in a pattern. First thing you need to do is basically figure out what URL is going to store all of this stuff. So the way I like to do this is to go and basically generate a private web page on my website. I'll go into my web host and I'll create a page, but I will remove it from the navigation bar, any kind of the navigation maps, so that you have to have the URL in order to be able to find it. Likewise, I'm going to basically in the metadata for that page tell Google to basically not index it. So don't show it up in search results, and basically turn all of my SEO, search engine optimization settings off so that it's not showing up in Google search results and people aren't really able to find this page unless they already have the URL. So that's kind of my preferred way to do it, but there are others. You could kind of dump all of these resources into a Google Drive folder and then just generate a shared link for that folder, a shared URL. That's totally fine. The drawback to that is that if anything shuffles in your Google Drive or, things update, settings change, right? Sometimes that URL link can change the address a little bit. They're not really meant to be permanent. So you kind of have to keep on top of that and make sure your links are updated. You could also put it on a password protected web page on your website. So basically you would generate a web page just like we talked about, link to that in the QR code, and then put a password on it. And then somewhere in that explanation of what this digital resource QR code is, you say, hey, the password's X, right? And then they can scan it and find that web page and log in and get access to all of these digital resources. Just kind of adds an extra layer of protection. But you could also do it with a coupon code. So you could create a product on your website and then just include the coupon code inside that pattern in the explanation of what the digital resources are so that people can get access to them for free. And that way, if you have somebody that just wants the digital resources for whatever reason, but they haven't bought the pattern, they can still get it. They just have to pay for it, which is totally fine. Now, the drawback to all of these methods is that there's no bulletproof, simple way to make sure that people that haven't bought the pattern don't get access to the web page. Basically, all of these are just kind of links that are only shared with the people that have bought your pattern. That doesn't stop them from showing the QR code to a friend or sharing the pattern with a friend, sharing the coupon code, sharing the URL, any of those things. But at the end of the day, if people want to share those things and kind of circumvent the process of buying the pattern, violating the copyright, they're going to do that anyways. If they're determined they're going to do it, they're going to find a way around it. So me personally, I prefer to just kind of let that be. I'm aware that it's happening, but it's a fairly low percentage, so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to exhaust effort trying to stop that from happening. The way around it would be to basically host a membership where you're making all of these different groups for people that have bought certain patterns. That gets really expensive and really out of control really quickly. So this is a much simpler version, not bulletproof, but it works all the same. So once you've kind of generated the URL that has all of these resources, you need to generate a QR code for it. There's a bunch of different ways to do that. Many of them are free. So Canva's got a free QR code generator. You just take your URL, plug it in there, and it'll generate a QR code image that you can embed in your pattern. QR Code Monkey is another one. That's just a free website that you can plop in a URL and generate these things. There are paid versions of these things that will actually allow you to put in fancy logos and things in the middle of it. If you really want to do that, go for it by all means. But these are all going to be static QR codes. So if for whatever reason, you change websites, you change domain names, anything like that, you're going to have to set up a redirect for it so that this URL is still going to point towards those resources, or you have to update your paper pattern, one or the other. Now, there are paid services that'll allow you to generate dynamic QR codes. And basically what that is a single image. So the image is static, but what it's linking to can change in the background. So if you update your website, update the domain name, instead of having to set up all of these redirects, you just change what URL it's pointing to in the back end. Those are really cool, really, really helpful, but they are going to cost you like some sort of monthly fee. It's usually fairly low, you know, a couple bucks a month, but it's something to consider. If you do go through some sort of big major website overhaul and don't want to set up all of those redirects, what you can do is just get little stickers, QR code stickers, new ones generated, and then whatever stock you have of those old patterns with the old QR code, and you can just add those stickers over top of the QR codes, and then update the file so that the next time you get a print run, you've got the new QR code linking to the correct website in there, and it's no big deal. Alrighty, that's all I've got for today. If you found it helpful, please make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode of Tech Tip Tuesday.